All right. Welcome to the CatholicPsych Show. I'm psychologist Dr. Bryan Violette. I am not here with psychologist Dr. Greg Bottaro. We have a replacement today, our first alternate, our first sub. I'm here with Jack Beers. You may know him from various strange corners of the Catholic world. But I know him as a Catholic Psych partner.
Oh, yeah.
Jack has gone through our CPMAP program. I supervised him once upon a time and still supervise him a little bit. And he is a clinician with us. So, Jack, welcome to the show. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. I didn't know that I was going to do the show with a bona fide leprechaun today, but I am. And I think I'm just thrilled. I'm thrilled to be a part of this pot of gold,
Well, look how much more colorful we are when Dr. Greg's not here. We got the pastel.
Yeah.
The pastel shirts. Yes,
Polos.
I mean, this is a great segue. We're talking about the green shirt that I'm wearing. It is in honor of the topic that I'd like to start with today.
Okay, and what's that?
I want to talk about sports. I want to talk about sports from a Catholic psychological perspective. And this is representing the green of the Boston Celtics, who have made their way into the NBA Finals. But we're not going to get super granular. For all you non-sports people, you don't have to worry about us talking about stats and players, but we want to talk about big picture, what sports mean from a Catholic perspective, the psychology of sports, the spirituality of sports. There are a couple big news stories around sports that have come out recently that have reached the popular culture. One of which involves the death of Bill Walton.
Yeah.
Amazing story. He's I'm a professional. I mean, I'm not a professional basketball player, but that's where I have the most interest is in professional basketball because that's all I have time for because I have a wife and children. I used to like all sports and then it just kept decreasing. So it's like all sports and then some sports and then just the NBA. And now it's just like Celtics and then it's like Celtic reels on Instagram. That's much
I remember being 20 and spending a year watching somewhere around 75 hockey games, around 70 basketball games, all of March Madness, about 150 baseball games, and all 16 NFL. The New York Giants is my team. I watched every single one of them plus the playoffs. Now I'm like, how many games do I watch in a year? It's not 20.
It's not 20. Yeah. Life in my early 20s, I would plan my weekend around sports.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
Binging all day long.
For sure.
But that's not allowed anymore in the Violette household, in the Dr. Violette household. Welcome everyone coming to the chat today. I think we got our text message out so people know that we're going live. We're still working on getting the software set up for live call-ins, but that's coming. So if you have some questions, you want to engage with us and talk with us today, please respond in the chat. So Bill Walton dies. Very interesting guy. Very interesting man. Had a lot of success in sports, in basketball. In college, he won 2 national championships with UCLA, which is very difficult to do when consecutive or multiple national championships in college. They went on to the NBA. And he was a fantastic player, revolutionized the position. He was much more unselfish. He was very Catholic. He was very relational at the center position, very tall man. And then he got hurt. It was kind of a sad story. And afterwards, he kind of revitalized his career a little bit, won a second title with the Boston Celtics, which I'm always happy to talk about, coming off the bench and kind of made the best of his career, reinvented himself, let go of his ego. Right. But that's probably not why most people know him. He went on. I mean, there's a couple of interesting things about his personality where he went on to get into broadcasting. This is important. Broadcasting is near and dear to both my heart and your heart. You had dreams to become a sports broadcaster when you were young. I also did. I did my local basketball, my high school basketball team's live games. I would broadcast that. But neither of us do that now. But at least today we have a microphone and we can talk about sports. So he went into broadcasting. But the thing that people often don't know is that he overcame a major stutter. He had a terrible stutter before, like his whole life. And then upon coming on the air and becoming a broadcaster, he had this very vibrant, life-filled personality. He went on tangents. And he would tell these crazy stories. He's a pretty big hippie. It's a big part of his identity. He was big on the Grateful Dead, and he was just a happy man. And when he died 2 days ago, the world of social media was pretty responsive, and it's his death hit my newsfeed from a lot of different angles, not just from a sports angle, but other kinds of news feeds would highlight his death. Do you know much about Bill Walton? Do you have any opinions on Bill Walton? What he means, how he's transcended sports?
If you ask anyone who the greatest college basketball player is in the history of college basketball, there are essentially like two acceptable answers. It's Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or Bill Walton. I mean,
right.
that level of excellence. And then when he was great. I mean, he beat Dr. J in the NBA Finals. I mean, he was on his way. And then injuries completely derailed him. So my love and appreciation for Bill Walton was totally behind one of my favorite things about sports in general, and what I think makes sports so great and so important to the human experience. Is it like
not a waste of time? Not just a waste of time?
No, it models the arc of the human person. It's like he had to reinvent himself. Right. Yes. Like he had to put his ego aside in order to contribute to a broader experience. It's like life. Like you start to get older, you reach your peak of your powers, your influence, and then you start to drop down, and you have to find new ways to contribute and to be a part of things. And he didn't let injuries derail him, take away his joy from the game, or he didn't make it about him. And I love that about Bill Walton. Like he loved the game. He played it the right way. He didn't let injuries get in his way. And that's what I remember about him. He obviously played before I was a fan, before I was even aware. But that story moves through time, right? Like it doesn't die. It's still there. You can actually, it was still palpable whenever you heard about Bill Walton, just sort of the legend of his greatness, and then him, and then him kind of having that arc. So that's what I know about him.
Yeah, it plays deeply into like how we perceive competition, and how much of our ego is attached to competition. There's a lot of athletes that take a little bit too long to retire, or at the end of their career, they think that they are the player that they once were, right? And it actually is a detriment to their team. And like, I understand this myself a bit. Like when I started to get older and I was playing basketball, I thought that I was better than I was. Like my mind would play a certain way, but my body wouldn't follow up. And it was very difficult for me to let go of my identity as that kind of player, and have the humility to kind of switch roles and actually contribute from a team perspective, rather than like have it all be wrapped up in my own ego.
And that was totally on display with Tom Brady and Tom Brady's retirement, right?
Yes.
So Tom Brady, physically he could have kept playing, but look at all the things that it cost Tom Brady to try and play as a 45-year-old man who's accomplished
his marriage.
Yes, it cost him his marriage, his time with his kids, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Ego can really cost you a lot. And you can see some of the most admirable moments of sports is when there is no ego. Like we're just talking about basketball. Like, what's the best basketball to watch? Is it one-on-one basketball, or is it team-driven, move the ball,
unselfish, everyone contributing, all the players being a star in their role?
Yes.
Not upset that they are not the star of the team, but they're a star in their role. And there's a collective spirit to it. So how do we make sense of competitiveness in sports? How do we make sense of what you're talking about? People who, like, from a psychological perspective, people who can't let it go. Have any thoughts on this?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that's really hard for anyone, and it spans across outside of just sports, but like when you have an identity, when you identify as a thing, or you identify with a specific aspect of your personality.
I am my gifts.
I am my gifts.
I am how smart I am. I am how good looking I am. I am how rich I am. I am how famous I am. I don't know. We can go on and on, right?
Yes, I am that thing. Or even like I am a joyful person. Well, how do you reconcile with a period of sadness in your life, right? Like
Sure.
the idea that we could look at Tom Brady and be like, how could Tom Brady ever do that? We all like that identity piece that's connected to our self-perception of who we are. It's really hard to let go.
Yes.
It's really hard to even be aware of. Like, how do you even know it's happening when it's happening? Which was one of the questions I had for you. Like, how do you even know when ego is getting in your way?
Probably by your reaction when things don't go well.
Yeah.
You know, if you're established, like if you, I mean, a lot of this is unconscious. You know, it's not as if people are going around saying that I don't feel loved if I don't win. But if you think of affirmation that comes to someone for different reasons in their childhood, like that's the big question to explore. How does someone get to this point from a psychological perspective? You know, say I was growing up in a home where if I brought home a B plus, and my parents said, "How come you got a B plus?"
Yeah.
Versus you got an A, great job. Right? It's not as if the parent was communicating, "I only love you if you get an A plus" explicitly. But for a child who's living in the world of like more of an emotive place and they're not as articulate in terms of like the maturity that comes with understanding ideas and thoughts and nuance with adulthood and maturity, that's what the child can receive. Like, I am good if I get an A plus. I am loved. My parents care about me if I get an A plus. The same thing can be transferred to sports, right? If I am the best player, if I am successful, I will get affirmation for that, attention for that, love for that. And if I don't, then I am bad. I am unlovable. I have no value. Right. And
Yeah,
so
I think there's another aspect of it too, which is if you most of the professional athletes, let's just say, they have been top of the food chain when it comes to sports.
oh yeah, that too.
Their whole life, right?
Athletic gifts put them ahead of their peers.
Right. So
Yeah.
like you actually probably don't have a vision of yourself without being great at sports. So if you were to ask yourself, like, am I lovable without being great at sports? You actually don't have a memory
Yeah.
of whether or not that's true or not. Even
Right.
if everybody's been great to you your whole life, there's a voice in the back of your mind that's like, they're probably only here because of the value I bring as an athlete.
Right.
And they're not actually here because of me. And
Yes.
and if it's just me, then
Yes. Yeah, it's a tricky thing when you're a parent and you have children that have gifts. But because of course you want things to go well for them. But how do you communicate to a child who is pretty successful at something
yeah.
that it's okay if they're not?
Yeah.
It's like to really enter into those moments where they fail and you still want them to do well. So how do you say, well, this is a learning experience? Yeah, but even that still points towards you need to be successful at the sport.
Yeah.
Like, you know, or the schoolwork or whatever, or the violin or whatever it is that they're exercising their gifts for. So to really say, give them permission to maybe even quit,
Yeah.
not force the child. I think that's probably the only thing that can push against it.
I'm going through an aspect of this with my son right now.
Yeah.
He has just discovered the desire to win at things.
Boys have I mean, because of the testosterone levels and the competitiveness, I mean, when I can't get my son to do anything, if I make a game out of it,
Yes.
the motivation levels go like this. His T levels just get like sucked up into whatever the activity is. Boys love winning.
Yeah. That's how I get him to go upstairs to bed every night. Like,
Oh yeah.
my daughter so hard to get upstairs to bed because
yeah.
competition doesn't matter.
Right, but who's going to brush their teeth faster?
Yes.
They're running.
He's
Or he is anyway.
just going. But I beat him in a race the other day. And it was like
he hated it, I bet.
He hated it. He started to cry. And I asked him if he wanted to race again. And he was basically like, only if I win. And so like we're in this thing where he wants a guarantee he's going to win as a precondition to competing because he doesn't want to lose, and he's trying to figure out how to lose.
Is that not the young sports culture today? Everybody gets a trophy.
Yes,
because of that developmental stage.
Yes, and it's been a great conversation between my wife and I, because my wife is like,
let him win.
Just let him win. Like, what are you upsetting him for? And I'm like, nah, I'm gonna beat him 1 out of 3 times. Like, I'm just gonna do it. If he runs his hardest, for the most part, like I can let him go. But he also needs to know that he's not faster than dad. Like he also needs to learn to lose. Like one day he's gonna do it.
I read a study once that it's like good to wrestle, like with sons. It's good for fathers and sons to wrestle, but and they actually love when you like dominate them physically, as long as you let them win 30% of the time. So they have to have some sense of competency, or else like, why am I going to fight if I just get absolutely dominated by my dad? But they actually love to lose because they love the sense of the power that you have on some unconscious level, because it makes them feel safe and protected. But it also plays into just the desire to be competitive and be competent, Yeah.
I remember this is just a worthy story to break down. But I remember the first time I went to beat my dad in basketball. My dad is like 4 inches, 3 inches shorter than me, 4 inches shorter than me. And I'm like 15. And I cross him up and I'm heading in for a layup, which is an easy basket. Like, I'm going to win. And all of a sudden I feel 2 hands on my back. And my dad shoves me into the fence, which is right behind our thing. And he comes over and he extends a hand and he's like, "That was a foul. You're a ball." And I totally melted. Like, he won. Yeah. I totally melted in it. And I remember like sitting with him after the game and him being like, "You're going to beat me. It's going to be soon. You got to earn it."
But not yet. Well, it's interesting. It's like when we're doing our clinical work and, we might self-disclose to our clients. And then the big question around like, when is it proper to disclose our life to our clients? And the question becomes, is it for me or is it for them? Right? Like, am I relying emotionally on my client to take care of my struggles or things that I've gone through? And if that's the case, that's a problem, because if you consider a clinician-client relationship, it's parental, and we can go into how there's projection and, you're providing a corrective, loving experience to your clients, but you don't want to create a dynamic in which the child has to take care of the parent. Those are often unhealthy. And we know lots of situations where clients come up in a home where they have to take care of the emotional needs of their parents, and it creates a lot of problems because they're bound to fail at it. Nobody can take care of the emotional needs of one's parents. So, but the point is, when you're working with a client, you want to give of yourself for them. To the example you gave, did your dad throw you into the fence because he was trying to teach you about life and how you're not always going to win? Or could his ego not take losing to you? It's a fine line, isn't it?
It is. It like part of me like really respected my dad for being like, this is what I would do to an equal. Right. Like, I would make an equal beat me with a jump shot or whatever it is. Like, so part of it was like, this is cool. We're on the same playing field right now.
Yeah.
And then another part of it was like, he just didn't want to let go of the days when he knew that he didn't want that day to be the day. And that was like, it was bothersome, but it it speaks to the spirit of competition, right? Like it only motivated me more.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know if you feel this way, but sometimes I feel like a particular scripture passage is speaking more to men than it is to women, or more to women than it is to men. Like it's not meant for men, or it's not meant for women, but it's like it's playing more to the feminine genius part than it is to the male. And
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, we're called to grow in the gifts of the other. You know, we're called as men called to, first of all, establish our idea, make sure our identity as men is established, but then we're drawn out of ourselves by the beauty of what women have to offer, and vice versa. So yeah, it could apply primarily to one, but we should pay attention to all of it because it'll apply to us at some point.
right. Well, St. Paul talks about like the spiritual life as a race, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm running the race, and
Yeah.
that tends to work really well in times of doing ministry or things along those lines. Like men tend to gravitate more toward that phrase. And I'm really curious for you and how you look at healthy competition, which is like I'm running the race. Like St.
Yeah.
Paul is talking about the spiritual life on competitive terms, right?
Yes.
Like healthy psychological competition versus, we're teetering into maybe some unhealthy, maybe some selfish, maybe some ego competition.
Yeah, well, my take on this isn't really my take. I learned about this issue from an exorcist, actually. So this isn't just psychological. This is spiritual. There's a spiritual component to this.
Oh, let's buckle up. Integration, spiritual,
Yeah,
psychological. Let's do it.
for sure. So I was talking to an exorcist about a case that I was working on, and the distinction between what's happening psychologically and spiritually versus something spiritually with someone. I mean, number one, there's no psychological experience that doesn't have a spiritual dimension to it. So it's we have to separate these things because our finite minds don't know how to mash them all together. Just like God is love, right?
Yeah.
He's eros, like eros, agape, all these different ways in which we explain love. Like, no, he is love. It's one reality, but we don't, we're finite. So we have to break it down into parts. It's all Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle and distinctions and everything else. That's the West. So spirituality and psychology, we define them differently, but they come together into one reality. But when you're helping someone, it's very difficult to discern like what to target. And sometimes the prayer of the exorcist, if there's some kind of spiritual attack going on, is the only thing that can help. Or the spiritual experience is like the fanning the flames of psychological wounds. And so that's why we would consult with an exorcist, first of all. But I was talking to this exorcist one time about competition, and he said, "Oh, Satan loves competition." And I said, well, "What do you mean?" Like, yeah, he loves it. He loves it. Anytime one is ranking themselves above or below other people, it's a problem, because God loves us all equally. Christ came to die and would die for each one of us uniquely and individually. And he doesn't rank us in terms of his love for us. And so when we start to rank ourselves, what typically happens is, in order to put ourselves above someone else, we hurt someone. Right. And this is the danger of being really elite at anything. It's like, how do you get there? How do you become the leader of the free world without hurting people? And as you're moving up the ladder, there's also a temptation. Like even if you go into something for the right reasons, there are still temptations to abuse power as you're rising up any particular ladder that you're attempting to climb. So in the world of competition, typically you have to hurt someone else. Now in psychology, this sort of ranking, unconscious ranking, happens in the context of narcissistic defenses, right? And sometimes even dependent defenses, right? Where for the dependent person, it's they are better than someone else, is better than I am, therefore they must solve all my problems or rescue me or save me. For the narcissistic set of defenses, it's I am better than you, therefore you matter less, right? In the spiritual life, so Satan loves this because it can cause us to sin if we look at competition in that way. So I said to this exorcist, I said, "Father, I mean, so what does this mean? We should never compete ever at all?" He said, "No, that's not true. we should strive for excellence. We should strive to be the best that we can at whatever contest we're competing at, not just sports, but in life, whatever. And because this gives glory to God because of his omnipotence and his ultimate competency. It gives glory to him. We are made in the image and likeness of God. But if you're competing against someone, you have to intend and hope for them to do the exact same thing. You want them to be the best versions of themselves. And at the end, there happens to be a score. But you want to be doing your absolute best, and you want someone else to be doing the absolute best. And that's the way out of the I'm better than you or you're better than me trap, which can cause a lot of spiritual danger. What's your take?
So what's so interesting about that, and I think it's totally true, because you're actually competing mostly against yourself in that context, right? You're competing against your own ability to be excellent, and you're trying to be excellent. There was actually a perfect example of exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
In the NBA playoffs recently. So before game 1 of the Western Conference Finals between the Dallas Mavericks and the
I know what you're alluding to. Go on.
The Minnesota Timberwolves.
Yeah.
The best player for the Timberwolves, Anthony Edwards, was asked about the matchup or whatever. And he specifically talked about wanting to lock down the second best player on the Mavs, Kyrie Irving. And Kyrie Irving, they basically played the clip for him and was like, what's your reaction? This guy's going to lock you down. And Kyrie, who has spent his whole career being immature and selfish and all this other stuff, has had this clear change.
Maybe.
Temporary.
We'll see what happens when the wheels come off. Let's see if he regresses into his selfish behavior.
Well, I think we gotta hope for the best here. Okay. He's articulating a different person. And his response was, that's part of what makes him great. And I look forward to playing against him. And I hope we do our best. We both play.
Great response. Yeah.
Incredible. Right?
Yeah.
Like that was sort of an integrated response competitively. Like that's what makes him great, and I can appreciate that,
Yeah. I actually thought you were going to bring up another moment in the series when one of the players hit the last second shot, and there's all these clips of him swearing and cussing and saying, I'm better than you. You can't guard me. And it's almost like you look at his face and how contorted it is, and like there's like evil spewing out of him. Right. And you take all like that whole kind of ego based, I'm better than you, who's better than who, in the Western Conference, and you juxtapose that with the team oriented, lifting each other, all stars in our roles, Boston Celtics. Typically those are the championship teams. It's not the ego based kind of approach to competing. The other thing that's coming to mind here, because I don't want to alienate the entirety of our audience, but I also want to tread very carefully when I'm talking about women, because I'm not one, is what comes to my mind with women is competition around like physical appearance and not just, but like clothing and like that whole kind of world that I think we as men we don't actually have access to it. I'll talk to my wife about like what happened at a party afterwards. And I believe myself to be pretty astute at understanding the human condition, given what I do. But she picks up on things that I have no idea is going on.
Yeah.
Like these kind of like subtext conversations with women, with jealousy and all these things. Yeah. And it's all this kind of like the same version of the competitiveness that can happen with men. Men kind of like posture more physically, but women oftentimes I've heard, I mean, you can tell me in the chat, tell me if I'm way off on this, but oftentimes women don't dress up for men. They dress up for other women.
Yeah. And
there can be a lot of toxicity that goes on in female dynamics around the competitiveness of who has more value because they are more attractive, or they have more money or more clothing or more money to put into clothing or whatever it is.
Yeah. I'm actually working through that exact thing in an accompaniment context, where the competitiveness, the actual I don't know why I've stopped dressing up question is actually a great psychological question.
Why I've stopped dressing up?
Yes. Yes. Why I've lost the motivation to dress up for a female. And I never would have thought about it, but it just kept coming up. It kept coming up. It was clearly important, and just asked the question, and it opened up this whole big portal of this female to female dynamic around competition that I have two sisters, like I had no clue about. But if you contrast that, I remember when my wife, the first time, like she was afraid giving birth, she was afraid. And I told her, I said a number of things that did not land as it related to her and her preparation to having a baby.
Yes.
So I was like,
it's best that we just sort of stay out of the way.
Yes. Yes. But I was like, naive. It was the first pregnancy.
Yeah.
And eventually I was like, hey, this is your Super Bowl. Like, this is like,
you're saying this did not land?
No, this landed.
It landed.
It landed. I was like, hey, this is like your Super Bowl. This is like your Olympic medal round. Like, you're preparing for this emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, and physically. Like, you're preparing for this epic day, hopefully just a few hours, but epic day of
giving
exertion.
Birth.
Yeah. And I saw her like
labor and birth. She liked it.
she lit up. She was like, yeah. You know what? The day I give birth, that is my Super Bowl. And I just saw this like fire get into it, and there was this desire to be great for the sake of the baby.
Yeah.
That emerged. That was like a really cool self-competitiveness,
Yeah. We got a comment on here from Globella123. We women are hyper aware of other women's appearance. Vanity is rampant with the media, entertainment, and media systems. Yeah, for sure. There's definitely a cultural context here, right? Cultural external influences on the way women should look and how men should look, and like the sort of kind of social pressures around that, and it's upsetting.
No question.
And then,
go ahead.
No, I was also thinking about. Have you ever read that book Wild at Heart?
Yes.
And there's Eldridge was the author who wrote the book, and he talked about like kind of like there's some, from a Catholic perspective, we would disagree with some of the theology in that book, but psychologically, he's definitely onto something. It was a heart-wrenching book when I first read it. And he talked about this core question for men around competency. Can I do it? Right. And then his wife, he wrote a book with his wife afterward about the female heart. I forget what it's called. It's Enchanted. Something like that. Something like Enchanted or something like that. But the core female question is, am I desirable? Am I wanted? Right. And it's so interesting from a psychological perspective that, like, in this world, we can measure ourselves with those two core questions only up to a certain point where a decline sort of begins. Like, I'm less competent today than I was yesterday. And what do I do with that? What's my relationship to that in terms of my ability to be successful in this world? I always make the joke, like, I'm getting balder, dumber, and fatter every single day, right? And so, like, that's not 25-year-old at its peak, at the peak of his powers, who's sharp and athletic and, probably better looking than I am now. And then for women, there's that youthful grace that accompanies attractiveness. And that's not to say there aren't amazingly beautiful women. And I think a healthy, almost non-pornographic view of a woman sees their interior beauty and how it rests on their body, right? This is a lot of JP2 stuff, like the body is the visible, which makes visible the invisible, the interior spirit. And so no matter what happens, but the female body, like, if you're looking at the standard for your value and whether or not you're loved is how you look when you're 25, like, that's a tough pill to swallow. And so it becomes a question of, like, what do we do with these declining, I guess, secondary qualities within which we place our value?
Yeah. Well, it's the manifestation of the fear of death, right? Like, it's sort of the up here version of the thing that's happening down here. which is like, I look in the mirror and I'm becoming worse and worse and worse. Which am I less competent? Am I less attractive? It's like, there's that, but it's actually a lot deeper. One of the reasons why I love this question is because, like my wife and I have had conversations about this a number of times, because my wife will say things like, I hate my body. I hate my body.
Yeah.
And I, as the man, like, I want to fix it. Like, I don't, take my view of your body. I don't hate your body. I love your body.
Yeah.
And it's just this wrestling between the two of us, where she was like, I appreciate that, and I believe that I still hate my body. And she shared with me something the other night where she was like, our daughter has my body, and I love our daughter, and I love her body. If I love her and if I love her body, I can no longer hate my own.
Oh, what a brilliant, beautiful insight.
Isn't that incredible?
Yeah.
And I was just floored by it, but it was something that sort of happened organically and subconsciously, and by the Holy Spirit, where it was like, there's this question she wrestles with. It's something that Jordan Peterson says a lot. He'll be like, hey, listen, I've been wrestling with this question for 37 years, and I think I finally have an answer to it. He's the only person that has ever spoken like that, but it actually speaks to a human experience, where, like, my wife has been wrestling with that question. Like, why do I hate my body for a long time?
Because of the messages that go all the way back, and being wounded and being hurt. Yeah.
And the fear, the messages that go all the way back, and then the fear of not being good enough, and then the fear of dying, and your body getting worse, and your body changing, and all this stuff. And then you get this, like, glimpse of the eternal perspective. You get the glimpse of the godly perspective. And it's just like, there's this spirit of peace and detachment. And it's like, I want to be as healthy as I can for my kids, but I'm grateful for the body I've been given. And it's like unbelievable.
Yeah. Yeah. We have Randy offered some thoughts on this. I think the better question is, why are women competing with one another, be it dressing up or something else? As a woman, I see us dressing up and trying harder, not just for its own sake. Yeah. So why are we competing? And I think this goes back to what we were saying about those childhood messages, in terms of where we receive love and attention for the wrong reasons at an early age. There's the implicit messages of affirmation, right? And I think, well, generally speaking, it's both parents' jobs, but the father in particular offers affirmation for the child's existence. I am glad that you are here, independent of what you do. I just delight in your presence. And children pick up on that. Like, are you excited to see them every time you see them? Like, what's happening? Like, you can't hide that from your kids. If you have stress levels, I mean, look, no, there are no perfect parents out there, right? We have original sin. We have the fall. That's a lot of why some of this gets twisted. That's the short answer to your question. But as much as possible, we want to consciously be present to our children in a way that affirms, like, their goodness. I remember when we put my son in soccer, and there was this debate between my wife and myself about whether or not to put him in soccer, and he was 2. Right. And I think it's under 5 is the first group. And so, but you can enter it like at 2 and like 2 turning 3. And I was really, really hesitant. My wife couldn't understand why, but I knew why. Cause it was like, you don't understand. Once we do this, it begins. Like, the innocence is now gone. Now, as a boy, his social capital and whether or not he's liked is now determined by how athletic he is and whether or not he scores goals and how he plays on the soccer field. And she didn't quite get it. But now, as he's getting older, he's turning 5, he's turning 6, he's seeing the kids interact with each other a little bit more. And she's seeing the parents on the sideline screaming at the kids about these 5-year-old kids trying to play soccer. And how much pressure there is on a 5 or 6-year-old to be successful at it. But I knew, like, once you start here, once we put him in this, the clock begins. And he's now, like, we're losing him a bit. We're losing him even at 2 years old, where it's like, no matter what we're losing control. No matter what happens, we can communicate, like, We love you, even if you spill milk. But that's not the message the world gives. The world will reject you if you don't live up to the standards.
Some of my most vivid middle school, high school memories are peers getting after me for failed athletic endeavors and moments.
Mm-hmm.
None of the successes are really talked about. No. Pretty much just ridicule for the failure. And even to the point, like I remember my dad saying to me one time, when you play to win, you play your best. When you play not to lose or not to make a mistake, i.e. fear of ridicule, fear of being ostracized socially for
it just brings anxiety into your performance.
Unbelievable anxiety, right? And that the fear of ineptitude subconsciously, it just plays out in the context of competition or prove yourself moments. And I think it manifests itself in different ways for men and women in different contexts in general. But I mean, obviously, like one of the big stories, because we were talking about sports, one of the big stories in sports is Caitlin Clark.
Yeah,
and
this is a potential superstar in the world of women's basketball. Women's basketball professional basketball has not historically gotten a lot of attention at all. But this is a female player who is incredible at shooting 3-point shots, and she's like the female version of, supposedly, there's a lot of pressure on her, but the female version of Stephen Curry, who's the male equivalent to someone who can shoot that well. And so there's a lot of pressure on her to now carry the sport in terms of new popularity.
Yes, but what you find is, like, a lot of the commentators are really excited about Caitlin Clark. Like, they're hopeful that she will be to women's basketball what Mia Hamm was to women's soccer, which made it popular and relevant and national news, which women's basketball, hasn't been. I mean, they don't even have chartered flights, like they're commercial flying, because they don't.
There's no revenue.
There's no revenue there, right?
Yeah.
The people who are criticizing her and who are the most intent on tearing her down are fellow female players and players, ex-players.
Yes.
And the commentary around it.
I saw her get rocked with a pick, like real physical, over the top, knocked her down.
Yes. Yeah. And she is by far the most prolific rookie of the current class in terms of scoring, which is what she's there to do. She's there to score.
Yeah.
I mean, and yet she's getting tons of ridicule within the community itself. And it's just like, all boats rise to get, like, the rising tide raises all boats, right? Like, if she succeeds, they all make more money, they get more attention.
She'll be the face of the league. It's like LeBron James or Michael Jordan or Wayne Gretzky or Tom Brady. I mean, not that football needs it, but
they'd rather stay down here.
It's sports popularity is personality driven, just like social media and branding, right? We're so relational as human beings that we want to root for someone. We've lost the art of rooting for teams.
Yes.
As we've become more national and more, like, we've become a globalized society, and there's not that same allegiance to the local that there once was. But people follow personalities, and with Caitlin Clark, she has the potential to bring, usher in a new age for women's basketball. And the women are resentful of her.
Yes.
Why do you think they're resentful?
There's a threat there. There's something about her that is a threat. So the way that I've received it, and I want to know your thoughts too. Yeah. The way that I've received it, or can best apply it, is like, when you're 22 and you have your first job, and you work like a 60-hour week, and you come home and you're like still living with your parents or whatever, and you tell your dad, you're like, oh man, work 60 hours this week, like, I'm exhausted. And your dad goes, yeah, try doing that 60 hours a week for 30 years, carrying a bag across the country, right? There's a you haven't earned it yet. We've been toiling over here, working really hard. You've been handed everything. You haven't earned it.
Yeah.
I'm going to put you down.
Yeah, it's like people that you haven't been validated for everything you've put your father or these women have not been validated for everything they've the blood, sweat, and tears they've put into their efforts.
Yeah. There's an invalidation for them that has them lashing out at her.
Right.
And it has nothing to do with her and everything to do with the fact that they're resentful and frustrated that they're conceivably just as good, if not better, and haven't gotten the attention and haven't gotten the accolades. So that's what I think. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. I don't think I would add anything to that. I mean, I think the sad thing is having like you're missing out on a spirit of gratitude for what's possible. What Caitlin Clark could bring, or you know, I remember when I was in graduate school, I had a professor that had zero sympathy for us in terms of the amount of work he was giving us, and he was talking about how hard it was for him when he was going through his program. I remember thinking, like, well, if you know how terrible this is, why is that your response? Make it terrible for other people? Yeah. Like, why wouldn't you be like, it's awful, and I'm not going to do to you what someone did to me? Like, you're clinging to that bitter, angry resentment, and it's displaced and put outwards. So I don't know. Other thing I want to talk about too is like sort of sports as religion, and how I mean, people dedicate the entirety of their psyche to sports.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, it's like, I was going to make an analogy that's probably not that appropriate for a live show, but the fact that you can't actually affect the game that you are a viewer of is like inherently frustrating. So there's literally nothing you can do to affect the outcome. And even though people talk about, like, you know, if I were to say the Celtics, and I talk the pronouns that I use are like we, our team. Yeah. Oh, we lost the other night, as if I'm on the team. I'm not on the team, but I talk about it as if it's like an extension of myself, and the performance of that team is a reflection on how I feel. And I mean, I could be in a bad mood if the Celtics lose. I mean, I'm much better at it than I used to, but I mean, Celtics are in the NBA finals right now. I'm in a great place emotionally. Like it helps, but I'm not part of the team. So this sort of vicarious competition. Do you have any thoughts on why people like have obsess over that?
Wow. Well, that's not where I thought you were going to go, because one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is the rampant superstition in sports like the idea that you don't have control over your team, but you do irrational things.
Well, it's connected, I think.
As we'll say, because I'm like, you know, my dad's like, oh, I got to wear this jersey. You know, I got to wear this jersey when they play because this jersey's going to. I'm like, it's completely irrational, you know?
Sure.
So how are they connected?
Well, because we want to try and find a way to have control to affect the outcome. And it's complete fantasy to think that the jersey that we wear, the sock that we wear, or where we sit, or our pregame rituals would affect the outcome of these two teams competing, or two players competing against one another. But there, like I said, there's an inherent frustration in being victim's too strong a word. I was going to say like victim to an experience outside of us. But I think we want to have some kind of power and control. So that's a kind of like distorted way in which we can fool ourselves into thinking that we have control.
Conspiracy theories also are play huge in sports for this reason, because it's the tension of not having control but caring so much about it. It's almost like a small microcosm of being a parent. Where like you're playing out your frustration that you can't control what your kids are doing in this context of like sport, you know,
you're blaming the teacher for your child's bad behavior in school.
Yes, 100%. And so you create these things. Like I'm very few people, relatively speaking, are into hockey, but I love playoff hockey. And the culture around my favorite team is this idea that the refs are always against the New York Rangers.
All right.
So there's this conspiracy theory that there is a league-wide.
But only Rangers fans believe this.
Yes.
So this is something about subjectivity. Go on.
Well, it's this. There's this culture around fandom that's like, it's not that we didn't play better than the other team.
Yeah.
It's that in this particular one moment, there should have been a penalty called and there wasn't, because there's a league-wide conspiracy to prevent the Rangers from winning a game or the Stanley Cup, right? But that's just the frustration boiling over, the tension boiling over. And so their conspiracy theories just completely spill out because of it. There's, the refs are in the pocket of the other team, or there's TV ratings and all this stuff. And it's like, why is this happening?
Yeah. Well, I'm reminded of a couple things. The first thing that comes to my mind is like when I'll watch a Celtics game and I'll think that the refs were completely against us the whole time, and then I'll look at the ends, like the actual fouls called, and like sometimes it's tipped in the favor of the other team. It's like, was I watching the right game? Because it really felt to me like they were against us. But I'm also thinking about like when we work with couples, like in marital work, and you, like, the first time I started working with couples, I realized how much projection and subjectivity occurs in the human experience. Like, it's very hard to see in ourselves. Like, we perceive something, we believe it to be true because we can't step outside of ourselves. But when you're listening to two different people give two different accounts of the same argument or the same issue, it's like, wow, it's so clear that their assumptions and their interpretations of this, like, even in the silence, right? We have this technique that we use, like, it's called like blank slate technique, where I might just sit here quietly for 5 seconds. Let's just do it for 5 seconds. Now, for all our viewers, if we were sitting alone in a room and I did that for 5 seconds, that was 5 seconds. That might feel like an eternity. And you're left to wonder what was going on. Like, what was Dr. Bryan's motivations? Was he criticizing me? Like, I feel awkward. I feel this, for that. So, like, in the silence, we project our stuff onto other people. We make assumptions about what they're thinking or what their motivations are. And that's never more clear than in marital work. All this interpretation, all this projection. So yeah, the same thing happens in sports, obviously, constantly, where we're projecting, we're all these assumptions, and that also goes back to our childhood.
Well, I developed a friendship with a sports broadcaster who's the play-by-play voice of the Nets. Yeah. And he was coaching me a lot when I wanted to become a sports broadcaster. And one of the things he said to me is like, you'll know you're doing a great job when you get hate mail from both teams.
Both teams. Yeah.
When they're like, you obviously are rooting against my team. He's like, then I know I called a good game, But to your point, Dr. Gray talks about this. I don't know if this is his thing or if he grabbed this from someone else, but like,
he probably stole it from me, like always.
Bro, yeah, probably.
But go on. Takes credit for my ideas, but go on.
Well, now you have the floor to be able to clarify it. Or you just might be exhibiting projection. Who knows? The ABCs of response. A being there's an event that occurs. B being there's an interpretation of the event. And then C, there's a reaction to the event. And our brains perceive our interpretation of the event as reality. And our brains can't. Yeah.
It's cognitive behavioral therapy stuff.
Okay. Yeah. So our brains can't understand the difference between reality and our interpretation. So we just assume that the reaction is rooted in truth when it's really rooted in our interpretation of the event. And so we end up getting outside of the present moment and outside of reality often because of our interpretation of an event that may or may not actually be based on what's true and what's actually happening. And that happens in relationship the most. I mean, it's so prolific there.
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with just the reality that there's way too much stimulus for our brains to compute at any given moment. Like there's just so much going on that we have to be selective. It's like selective attention. And
Yeah.
then that's exacerbated even further when something appears to be a threat. And so we get tunnel vision for the threat. And this is how we lose mindfulness. We lose the ability to be present in the moment because everything focuses on that thing that we're frightened of. This can happen with social discomfort. It can happen with phobias, whatever it is. We don't have that expansive space to be creative and use our sort of imagination and just be present and see things for where they are. Like when Dr. Greg talks about Catholic mindfulness, if you're running down the jungle path and there's a tiger chasing you, you're not going to see the beautiful flowers right next to you. You're not going to see them. You're going to focus. You're going to target on that very frightening thing. So mindfulness training actually helps you expand that. But that's why mindfulness training is so helpful in the world of sports nowadays.
Yes.
And some of how the best performers under pressure are not zeroing in on their insecurities and their fear. It's expansive and it's creative. I know about this. Like I learned this a long time ago myself when I started to realize that when I practice a sport and I'm out in the court by myself and there's no pressure and there's no stress, I'm very creative. I'm very sort of open-ended in the moves that I do and the things that I attempt because there's no consequences. But when I'm in an actual game and there's all this extra anxiety and stimulus, I do the moves that I practiced the most.
Yeah.
That's what I revert to unconsciously. This is why, by the way, we often parent like our parents, because that's the example that we saw over and over and over and over again. And so, like when we're talking about how we would like to parent, which is maybe different than the way that we've been parented, it's free, it's creative, we can it's expansive, right? But when we're stressed at our kids, our mind goes, those neural pathways go back to those ways in which we like those things that we witnessed over and over and over again, and it's hard to break that pattern.
And I think the point that you alluded to as well, which is like it goes back to our childhood, it goes back to our upbringing. It's like that's the lens of the interpretation. So mindfulness is really useful for regrounding us in the present moment. But it's like that deeper work that is most transformative is when you're able to understand where the interpretation originated from. It's like I interpreted my husband forgetting to make dinner as he doesn't care about me.
Yes.
It's like you can use a mindfulness technique to prevent yourself from lashing out at your husband.
Yes.
But to stop interpreting his actions in that way, you have to go all the way to the core of the originating wound of I don't matter. And this is another example of being not mattering,
Right. And that's why, I mean, often when we're working with clients, I work with clients that complain about their spouses. Like that's all they complain about. It's like it's external locus of control. And I help them realize like, well, number one, I can't help you with your husband or your wife's problems because all I have is you. But we have to like look inward instead and look at like going all the way back and going deeper within the self to understand why we're perceiving things the way they are. And certainly there's unhealthy dynamics and hurtful actions that happen in a marriage, but most often it's like, how can we do work to help you focus on yourself that can affect change? And it's true even in marital, both people have to take responsibility and look at themselves to see what they're bringing to the table. And I think when you realize, I don't know about for you, but in my marriage, historically, I can be having a fight with my wife. And the moment I realize that it's not about my wife, it's about something that happened to me beforehand, and I articulate that, it really deflates the fight. Yeah. It disarms us. Now we're talking about like ways in which myself or my wife were hurt in the past. We're not fighting with each other anymore. Maybe it doesn't excuse any kind of behaviors that happen now that might be damaging, but the amount of emotional loading, the emotion, the compounding of emotion, because what's happening in a marriage is actually an overlay that feels like a way in which I was hurt going all the way back. That's when things can get explosive. But I think it's like a pressure valve when you're able to look at your past.
No question. My thing with Katie is like, I sometimes have trouble accessing my emotions in the moment.
Yeah.
And I'll be quiet like I will sort of take something in. So Katie will be super fired up about something, and I'll be silent, and then she would interpret the silence, and then we just start snowballing, right? Like she would have her own stuff, interpreting it, whatever. And what I've learned to do, it's been so it's taken down the tension of the moment a lot, is I'll just be like, hey, I really want to respond to exactly what you just said, but here's what I'm fighting in my head right now, and it's not you, it's this other thing over here.
Yeah.
And I need a minute to let that be before I can fully respond to what you have to say.
Yeah.
And oftentimes Katie will clarify, but it actually like elicits her compassion and her tenderness. She'll be like, oh yeah, that's definitely not where I was going. This is what I really meant. And it allows me to like have that moment and then be able to respond. Sometimes it's like 20 minutes into the snowball. Sometimes it's, 30 seconds into the snowball, but it's so useful to not just get grounded in the present moment, but be able to in a healthy marriage, let the other person in and be like, this is where I'm coming from, and I need help.
Yeah, it's terrifying. I mean, it's so counterintuitive in terms of what we expect will happen versus what actually happens when we are transparent and vulnerable and authentic. We are terrified that if we show what's going on in our most vulnerable places, that we will be completely rejected.
Yeah.
And especially men with women. I mean, not to make a sweeping generalization. There's exceptions, of course, nuance, of course, but oftentimes I found that the last thing I want to do in terms of being vulnerable with my wife is actually the most effective thing to do.
Yes.
The part of myself I do not want to show at all. When I show it, I get a response that I never would have in a million years anticipated. One of like love and understanding and tenderness. And it's like this whole original sin thing is brutal sometimes, Jack.
Yeah. To say the least, it's like God is in the present moment, right? And we want to be with God, and we want to work with God's grace. And we talk a ton about how sin removes us from the present moment and removes us from God's grace.
Yeah.
Defense mechanisms.
Yeah.
Remove us from the present moment too.
Well, listen, we gotta wrap up here. We usually do an hour, but it's been awesome to have you on. If you all like Jack, go check him out. He's a mentor, a Catholic Psych partner. He's a mentor. You can check him out at thecatholicmentor.com.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And you can work with Jack. He can help you navigate some of your issues.
And if you want me to replace Dr. Greg, just comment in the section. It's like Dr. Greg, I don't need you anymore.
Remember, they want me replaced. It is Greg and you. You never know.
No. I see the title now. Jack and the Leprechaun. That's the show. That's too far.
Thanks for coming on. Happy hump day, everybody. Hopefully we